Well, I'd like to begin with an exercise, really, the exercise that we were all introduced to when we very first joined the school, Philosophy Part 1, Session 1. So can I invite you all to sit upright and alert and be aware of your physical body, and let attention connect with each of your senses in turn. Connect with the sense of touch. Feel the weight of your feet on the floor, of your seat on the chair, of the touch of the clothes on your skin, the touch of air on the face and hands. Now be aware of smell. Be aware of taste. See light, shade, colour, form. And listen now to the furthest sound and beyond. And rest in the silence beyond that furthest sound. And letting all thoughts pass, be content to be here now, a silent witness. Now we get economic. With the eyes open, be aware of all the items that are within your sight. Be aware that just about everything you can see in your room, in the home in which you're in, is wealth. That's our subject matter, wealth. And in doing so, I'd like to just share at least if I can, I thought I had it, from Marcus Aurelius. And it's a quotation from Henry George's most famous book, but it's not Henry George. His most famous book was Progress and Poverty, written in 1879. But stay with the looking around your room. Marcus Aurelius said, "Make for thyself a definition or description of the thing which is presented to thee, so as to see distinctly what kind of a thing it is, in its substance, in its nudity, in its complete entirety, and tell thyself its proper name, and the name of the things of which it has been compounded, and into which it will be resolved. For nothing is so productive of elevation of mind as to be able to methodically and examine methodically and truly every object which is presented to thee in life. Keep looking at your objects, and always look at things so as to see at the same time what kind of universe this is, and what kind of use everything performs in it, and what value everything has with reference to the whole, and what with reference to man, who is a citizen of the highest city, of which all other cities are like families. What each thing is, and of what it is composed, and how long it is the nature of this thing to endure." So Henry George used this quotation at the beginning of his book, Progress and Poverty. and which was the inspiration to, as Peter said, to those who founded what we now call the School of Philosophy and Economic Science. And I would like this evening to reconnect with some of George's teachings by linking it with the philosophy that draws on the tradition of Advaita Vedanta. In doing so, and in introducing this, I'd like you to hear two further quotations, but this time from Shantananda Saraswati, our primary philosophical inspirer. In speaking about householders, and we might remind ourselves, our philosophical journey is in the form of householders. Shantananda Saraswati said, "Birds have two wings by nature, and it is the interplay of both the wings that allows them to fly high in the sky. If one of the wings is cut off or put out of action, then the bird is forced to stay on the earth and it cannot fly anymore. Similarly, there are two wings of our existence, the material and the spiritual. Somehow, people seem to prefer to the use of one wing only, and either cling onto the material wing or the spiritual wing. Since both are naturally necessary, there is much strife in search of bliss. Unless people do realize the need to use both wings and refrain from being partial, the Atman is deprived of freedom and bliss, which all seek. Unless this truth is realized, the work can't pick up speed, nor can the flight into the spiritual world materialize." Shantananda said that some years ago, and I'm now looking for the second quote, when Shantananda Saraswati spoke about the study of economics. And he said this to Mr. McLaren in January 1982. On the study of economics, he said, "Progress depends upon wisdom and practice. Those who have acquired proper understanding and have seen the laws of nature can project their concepts of possible progress in a convincing manner. Economics is an aspect of law, and the goodness of ancient laws lies in their usefulness for contemporary situations, but without damaging their basic form." And mark this, the ultimate unit for economic consideration is the family, which accounts for all individuals bound together with love, affection, and sacrifice. It's worth marking this because the common sense approach these days is that the ultimate unit for economic consideration is the individual. But mark, the ultimate unit for economic consideration is the family. For in the family, all individuals are bound together with love, affection, and sacrifice. There's no need then for any economic transaction. But the happiness of a family, Shantananda Saraswati goes on to say, depends on cultural, religious, and philosophical traditions of the society. But when cultural, religious, and philosophical traditions become weak, the disintegration of the family begins. Individuals become greedy for security. Once general greed takes over, the economic structure begins to crack. We might recognize something. One of the laws of nature is the true expression of what lies within. For nothing in nature is concealed. This is known as the law of cause and effect. Conscious application of this law of nature is to speak the truth. But a major part of conscious energy is being spent in not disclosing the truth. The result is that everyone is trying to convince others of the truth of their inflated needs by minimizing the natural needs of others. All this is being done by proposing new economic theories with total disregard to the laws of nature. But one must understand the laws of nature first, and then put them into practice on oneself before offering to others. That's the end of the quotation. So what both George and Shantananda Saraswati advise us is to understand natural law. In Sanskrit, we'll probably be familiar, or some of us may be, with dharma, natural law, which is a recognition that the natural world of physical phenomena, human action and thoughts are governed by universal law. And all things and events are part of an indivisible whole. And the other Sanskrit word that's pertinent here is Sanatana Dharma, eternal religion, which means it's behavior that is in harmony with this unity. So this is, if you like, where I'm coming from, is I have a profound respect for the laws of nature, for natural law, and the importance of behavior being in harmony with it. And I suspect part of that emphasis for me comes from my professional experience as an engineer. As an engineer, one needs a knowledge of certain sciences. The law of gravity is most obvious, I guess. But as a water engineer, I was familiar with all sorts of other laws of nature: biological, chemical, physical, hydraulics, and the like. And the one thing that you have to acknowledge in engineering is that those laws don't change. So very simply, water runs downhill, and you can't design a sewerage system or manage a river without acknowledging that fact. It's a law that transcends any man-made laws or requirements that people might seek. So an engineering structure has to be made cognizant of the natural laws that pertain in that area, and the arrangements that the engineer applies his abilities to have to recognize those natural laws and make the arrangements in harmony with them. And we can see this today, in fact, with many of the problems that confront the world, not just engineering, not just water. The whole environmental challenge of the age is an apparent ignoring of the laws of nature with regard to ecological affairs, with regard to the whole sphere of diversity and sustainability. So this recognition and importance of natural law in the material world is unquestionable. Everybody knows that, despite the fact that we may still be tempted to ignore it. But the sphere in which I'm speaking of this evening relates to natural law in the context of political economy. Political economy? Well, what's that? Mostly it gets termed economics these days, but it's very simple in a way, because many people will not be familiar with the term political economy, but everybody is familiar and almost everybody has opinions about the subject matter of political economy. Wages, interest, profit, wealth, poverty, unemployment, full employment, the budget. Does anyone not have an opinion about such things in some form or another? And are we not bombarded constantly through the media with views and assumptions about those issues? I think we are. So it's well to see, well, yeah, but all that's man-made arrangements, isn't it? Yes, of course they're man-made arrangements. The question is, are there any natural arrangements that need to be allowed for in making those man-made arrangements? So our subject isn't just political economy, at least not what I want to speak about this evening. It's the science of political economy. Not the politics of economics, but the science of political economy. Well, what's a science? Well, a science is an intellectual and practical activity based first and foremost on observation and reason. Hence my invitation right at the very beginning of this evening for you to observe. See what's in your sight within your home. Items of wealth, such as a glass of water. That's wealth. The house you live in is wealth. The clothes you're wearing is wealth. The meal you've just consumed is wealth. There's nothing immoral or improper about wealth. We are all absolutely dependent upon wealth. We need it 100%. But it's worth noting a couple of features about the fact that on the one hand, yes, we depend upon it, but we don't individually make or produce the wealth that we use. In fact, let's just mark a couple of features of what it is to be a human being. So the several aspects of our nature and the world in which we inhabit, which we need to take account of in our search for the realization of the truth about ourselves, material, physical, and spiritual. Biologically, we're embodied creatures. We're subject to animal instincts. But as man, our capacity to think and reason has enabled us to transcend the limits of instinct, so that we have come to enjoy dominion over all other creatures on this planet. Materially, we exist as individual people, but every individual person depends upon other people in order to survive, thrive, and indeed to more fully realize their potential. We are, by our nature, social creatures, utterly dependent upon others. Now, in our philosophy classes, our main focus is on how, given circumstances as they are, for each of us, we may, as individuals, better come to realize ourselves or our full potential as human beings. On the other hand, in economic science, or to give it its full name, the science of political economy, the focus is on how the socio-economic arrangements that all people are subject to might be improved, so that the opportunities for self-realization might be more widely available to everyone, to more, to all. So, where do we start? Well, let's start with what wealth is. And we're speaking here of material wealth. Natural materials that have been moved, modified, and changed in some form such as to be able to gratify, well, to gratify what? What does wealth actually gratify? Where does it start? It starts with us in desire. All human activity, all conscious human activity at least, starts in the subtle world, if not in the causal. But it starts with desire. I desire a drink. Water is from the tap, carried in a vessel. A desire is satisfied. Satisfaction is actually what we seek, to satisfy desires. Now, there's an interesting law of nature here that pertains to human nature. And Henry George identified this and was very strong on this. And in relation to political economy, he says it's the equivalent of the law of gravity in physics, a very fundamental one. That man, woman, people, seek to gratify their desires with the minimum of physical exertion. Think about that for a minute. Men seek to gratify their desires with the minimum of exertion. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that they always succeed in that. And it doesn't say anything about the quality of the desire, whether that desire be altruistic or selfish, generous or mean or vicious. Whatever that desire is, it is of the nature of people to seek to gratify it with the minimum of exertion, the minimum of toil and trouble. Nobody takes more trouble than they need to. Of course, it gets complicated because we don't tend to entertain one desire at a time. All sorts of desires overlap. And even, of course, there can be the desire for exercise, for sport, for exertion, in fact. But even then, we seek to gratify that desire with the minimum of toil and trouble. Now, I stress this because the supposition commonly is that people are naturally selfish. And indeed, the founder of the modern economics, Adam Smith, virtually indicated that when he indicates how what people of the, and I can't quote you now exactly the words, they've slipped my mind, but essentially that people produce for their own selfish motives only. And that's not the case. There are so many altruistic aspects to why people produce. But whether they're altruistic or selfish, they will endeavour to produce them with the least exertion. One way in which you can see this playing out is that when you go to the shops, you don't pay any more than you need to, do you? You generally look like for like. Well, at the end of the day, all other things being equal, let's settle on price. Which brings us really to the fundamental measure of value, because value is central to the whole question of wealth. Because what we can say of wealth, the only certain thing in a way we can say about wealth, apart from where it comes from, is that it's valued. We all value wealth. That's by definition. If it's not valued, it does not fall into the category of wealth. But we have to be careful here, because whilst all wealth is valued, all that is valued is not wealth. There's much that is valued that is not wealth. For example, people, your husband, your wife, your sons, your daughters, your children, your mothers, your parents, all highly valued, aren't they? But they're not wealth. Sad to say, of course, throughout millennia, people have been treated as wealth. The whole chattel slavery industry was rebounded upon the confusion between material wealth and treating people as though they were wealth. So again, we're going to have to be very clear, as Marcus Aurelius advised us to be. Take care in what we describe and what the words we use to attribute to different things. And this is one of the problems, and I digress for a second, but I think I need to. The study of the science of political economy is actually extraordinarily simple, but it's also made enormously difficult by the fact that it doesn't have a language of its own. If I study almost any other science, physics, chemistry, astronomy, or whatever, or biology, I will learn terms that are not used in other ways. They are restricted, technical terms for particular things. So if I say a molecule, or an electron, or a proton, nobody gets confused, because they don't use those terms in common parlance. But the terms that we use in political economy are common language terms, wealth being probably the most obvious of them, but value likewise, labour, land, capital, all words that are used regularly, frequently, and all having different meanings. So we need, at the outset, in terms of any attempt at discovering the laws of nature as they pertain to the production and distribution of wealth, to be quite clear about our terms. And the first is the term wealth itself. Material substances modified by human labour so as to fit them for the gratification of human desires would be one such definition. But the first thing to mark is that it is material. We're not talking here about subtle things, although the root is subtle because lies in desire. But wealth itself, for the purposes of political economy, is not anything that has value. And I'll branch here a second again to speak about value. Because if I go back to Adam Smith in the very first instance, there are two kinds of value in economics. What's known as value in use, i.e. you value something because you use it, such as my glass of water, as distinct from value in exchange. I only value this thing because I can exchange it for something that I really want. And this is important. Bear in mind what we said. No man is an island, As individuals, we are intimately dependent upon others. And what this brings us around to is to appreciate that this propensity of human beings to exchange is what distinguishes us from every other creature. In fact, it's this ability and intelligence that allows us to surrender something that we value in return for something we value even more highly. This whole principle of exchanging is a win-win situation. I exchange with you and I part with this for your pen, let's say. And I would only agree to do so if on the point of the exchange I value what I have less than what you have. And you would only agree to the exchange if the reverse was the situation, that you value what I have to offer more highly than you're going to give. It's win-win. And in such a process, production is increased. Value added is increased. So this is the most refined form of producing wealth through exchange. Of course, it's the third tier, if you like, because long before we spoke about, well, we needed to speak about exchange, we could have been speaking about how the materials of nature are simply modified, changed, adapted for our purpose. So I cut down a tree and I adapt the tree to a log. I adapt the log to make a plank. I adapt the plank to make a chair. A process of manufacturing, adding value by adaptation. That's the first and primary source of producing. The second, most predominant one for many, many years, is the whole idea of growth, of growing things, agriculture. In fact, agriculture and cultivation. And the very word capital derives from that sphere, as you cultivated cattle, for example. And the thing about that is that you are growing, just as with your seed you plant, and more wealth is created through nature by growth. We now have adapting and growing and exchanging as the three modes of production, the three ways in which wealth is produced, where value is being added. But let's go back a bit and see, well, how do we measure value? What's the common measure of value? Well, we all know the answer to that. The common measure of value is money. We measure value, exchange value, by money. But that's not the fundamental measure of value. The fundamental measure of value is what I've referred to earlier: human exertion, the toil and trouble it takes to get or to produce the thing. That's the ultimate measure of value, sometimes called a labour theory of value, but you've got to be careful here, because there are different forms of labour theory of value. And it's not the labour that's gone into the making of such a thing that is actually is the measure. It's the labour that will be required to make the thing now. So the computer we're all using, unless we're using the very latest one, then almost certainly what you paid for it is not worth anything like what you paid for it now. Just as your car isn't, as you park it, you take it off and that's what you pay for it when it's originally, but it deteriorates because as time passes with technological progress, people are making more and more cars, computers and the like. So there's this question of value and two sorts: value in exchange, value in use. But the critical one for economic considerations is value in exchange. But I'm going now to two sources of value, two different sources of value. Value derived from production, i.e. that does indeed relate to what it costs to produce, and the value that is attributed to things because I can't do without them. A value that Henry George described as value derived from obligation. And the key example of that which has value from obligation is land value. We cannot live without it. We need to mark now and come to, if you like, the crux of the matter with regard to the factors of production. Land, as we've already said, everything comes from nature. Labour, human exertion. Two parties to the party. And the third category, which is capital. But capital actually is not a primary factor of production, because capital is very simply wealth. It is wealth that is not being used directly to gratify a desire, but wealth that is being used to produce more wealth. Let me go back to my cattle. The cattle that is being used to breed, and hence the term head of cattle was capital. And hence the idea of capital comes from that growing agricultural use. And of course, examples then of wealth that is being used to assist in the production of more wealth, of course, is stock, seed, tools, machinery, buildings, factories, cars, and the like that are, or vans, I probably should say lorries rather than cars, unless that car happens to be a taxi car, in which case the taxi driver's capital is his vehicle. So it's wealth that is being used to produce more wealth, but it's not a fundamental. So we've got two primary factors of production, land and labour. The other essential factor of production, but not primary because it is itself a product, is capital. And now when we wish to speak about the distribution of wealth, we have these two categories to consider. Land on the one hand, and labour and capital on the other. The fraction that goes to land, or the value that attaches to land, is known as rent. And rent is a natural phenomenon that arises whenever two or more people seek to occupy the same place at the same time, because that's impossible. So there has to be a mechanism in every human society as to how do we permit individuals to enjoy exclusive occupation of a particular place, a location, because they can't both occupy it at one and the same time. How do you share that? You share it again with this value, with the earnings. So the labour and capital earn, land produces rent. And so the fundamental challenge in this context is that division between the earnings of labour and capital on the one hand and the rent of land on the other. And that's a natural split. How am I doing for time, Peter? Sorry.
Yeah, we're okay for time. You're also co-host if you want to share anything.
Okay. No, I'm okay. I'm not particularly looking to share. But how long have I got now before I go to questions for say?
Well, another 5 minutes.
5 minutes for questions. Okay. Okay. So I've identified here these two primary divisors or primary factors of production in the first place, labour and land. And now we're going to speak about the distribution of the wealth that's produced from the conjoining of labour and land. And I've identified wages or earnings of labour and capital on the one hand and the rent of land on the other. There's a fundamental principle in humanity: thou shalt not steal. So the question arises, to whom do the wages and earnings of labour and capital belong? And to whom does the rent of land belong? And the proposition, essentially, is that the rent of land arises only from the number of people that are competing, from the community as a whole, as distinct from any individual effort. What's produced by labour and capital depends on the quality and use of that labour and capital. So the proposition is that the earnings of labour and capital is due to the providers of labour and capital. The rent of land is due to the community that protects the exclusive occupation of land for an individual and thus compensates those that are necessarily excluded from that exclusive occupation. Which brings us to the taxing question of tax. Where does public revenue naturally come from? And what are the consequences when it's not collected? And the proposition is that the natural source of public revenue is the rental value of land. To take in taxes from the earnings of labour and capital operates to discourage the employment or working of labour and capital. It also involves theft. So I'll just take a couple other little illustrations of how the laws of nature pertain to this. And let me speak about human cooperation. So human cooperation can take place in two different ways. By combining effort, so three or four of us get together in order to move something very heavy, so we combine our effort, and by cooperation we're able to do things that we can't do singly. Or indeed, we can separate our effort, i.e. by specialisation. And this, of course, is the major prize and what's really responsible for how mankind has progressed technologically to such an enormous degree that by specialisation or the separation of effort, all sorts of things are possible. So that you can earn a living as a violinist or as an engineer without having to produce any food or whatever, but you get fed because of specialisation. And we can now go to Mars or the moon or whatever because we've enabled people to specialise. But another aspect that's worth marking, and I'm conscious here that I'm skimming and bound to within the time frame, is there's two kinds of human cooperation. There's what we might describe as conscious, directed cooperation, such as you might get within a firm, or even more probably better still to illustrate it, an army, where a group of people are directed and consciously ordered to cooperate, work together. But then there's a more subtle form of cooperation, what one might describe as spontaneous or unconscious cooperation that arises between people, not because of any direction, but just because of the nature of what it is to be a human being, loving thy neighbour as thyself, if you like. But it's not deliberate, it's inbuilt. And I'll just use one more analogy, if I may, before I open or close for questions. And this is a rather beautiful analogy that I think Henry George uses when he draws a parallel between the wealth of a nation and the circulation of blood in the human body. The blood in the human body carries the nutrients of the food to every part of the human body. It distributes it naturally. If the wealth of a nation is distributed naturally, it will enter every part of a nation, of a community, and all will be fed and all will be well. I find it a really rather fascinating analogy. And of course, it links here with my experience in the distribution of water, where again, if I just come round to the natural law, one of the major laws of nature that appealed to me as a water engineer is, of course, the water cycle. It's the one that most people are very familiar with, that the water on the earth is participating in a cycle. There's a reservoir that's vertically static, but there's a circulation of water being recharged and recirculated, used again. And the challenge in that context for a sanitary engineer or a water supply engineer was to participate in that natural water cycle and doing no damage. The challenge goes on. That's probably enough for the moment. Any questions? You need to unmute, I guess. I'm happy to respond to any questions or observations that you might have. Or if you want me to go into any more detail of, for example, about the evils of our current tax system, for example. But I'll leave it to you. Anything that I've said that prompts a question or an observation? Yes, Robin, are you raising a pen of some sort?
Yes, a wand.
A wand, lovely. Okay.
Thank you first for such a clear exposition of the whole concept. I think my question is, given the great clarity of which you've described the natural law, how is it that it is still not accepted? And what are these resistances?
Right, okay, lovely. Well, thank you very much indeed, Robin. I mean, in a way, it's the obvious question, isn't it? When you see it, but it might be just worth, I'll answer you in a rather circuitous way, if I may. That you are probably aware that at one time we thought the earth was flat. And we were convinced that the whole universe revolved around the planet Earth. And there came along a man, was it Galileo, that proposed that that might not be the case. That indeed, Copernicus even, yes, thank you very much. That was not the case. And that was actually rather an unfashionable idea at the time. And certainly in the particular people, those that were supposed to know everything, in the Catholic Church in this instance, decided, no, this is not so. And they persecuted him. In fact, I'm not sure if it was Copernicus or Galileo or both that were finally executed. But it was contrary to the prevailing idea. And in any system, there will be beneficiaries of those that are, of the establishment, if you like, of those that are established. And I think it was Macaulay that once said, if there had ever been a pecuniary interest in the circulation of the Earth or the planets around the solar system, if there had been, it would be in doubt yet. There are interests at heart. And in our context, it might just be worth marking that the big change came in the British Isles with the conquest. Prior, and in many natural scenarios or circumstances, primitive countries, there is a wide recognition that this Mother Earth cannot be owned. It's a completely ridiculous idea. But William the Conqueror thought otherwise, and when he conquered, it became his. And he had quite a following, so he had quite a lot of other people to share that conquest with. And thus was created an enormous vested interest in the status quo and the very idea that I can own a gift of nature. Just as for millennia, the idea that I could own another person was common. And ideas are habitual to a very large extent. And when a particular set of ideas dominate, certain parties benefit, and those become the wealthy parties. And those wealthy parties are then able to orchestrate the laws. So in the case of the UK, for example, you're probably almost certainly aware that not only were the common lands of England denied by William the Conqueror, but King John, Henry VIII, the Tudors, the Stuarts, all made a pretty good go at privatising what was common land. And indeed, we then had Parliament. And of course, in order to be a member of Parliament, you had to be a land owner. Indeed, to cast a vote, you needed, until only a century ago, to be a land owner. So the laws of our country, the customs and traditions that then grew up, respected this idea. I can own the land. And it becomes, as it were, sacrosanct. So, and so you then have to introduce, largely to fight wars. And if you look at all the major modern taxes that we have, income tax, for example, VAT, trade taxes, customs and excise, and that, all introduced in order to fight wars. Napoleon in the case of income tax. Is that a response? It's not, Robin, does that give a clue to why it might be that these ideas are not popular with the establishment?
It does give a big clue. Would it be fair to call it an economic ahamkara that we've collected?
I guess it could. Yes, you could. Absolutely, it could be. Well, and indeed, that's the attraction. Thank you very much indeed for that other reminder, because that is the parallel that I see. We know that the ahamkara is, as it were, this propensity to claim as me and mine, which are really only instruments and tools and roles that we play, to take them as me and mine. And it's the same with, at a social level, the idea that this land is mine. Yeah, I think the ahamkara link is very apposite.
David, if I can ask you a quick question. Thank you for your presentation. It's very enjoyable. You mentioned the law of nature. Nature has intervened with the pandemic. So there has been a pause, which is celebrating its, if you can use the word celebrate, it's in this context maybe, but yeah, it's a year out now. So based on that, what is the school doing to challenge the status quo? And what would you recommend as me as an individual and the collective on this Zoom this evening that you would recommend that we should do?
I think the most useful thing that you can do is to ask questions, is to ask of politicians, ask of the press, ask of your own MP, why is such and such? What's the reason for that? I mean, here we are today, just for, and if you want then some ammunition, what you might like to do is to ask your MP, why do nurses cost us twice as much as a nurse actually gets? Simple question. Why is it that it costs the National Health Service, as it costs every employer, incidentally, roughly twice what their employee enjoys when they spend their wages? Let me illustrate that just for by way of illustration. I mean, I think we've just heard £35,000 a year is the average or a new nurse. Well, if you look at, and I'm sorry, I could have had it to hand, but I haven't actually got it to hand. But if you look at the taxes that even a person on £35,000 a year pays, they first of all pay, of course, income tax. Then they also pay national insurance on that. They will then, the employer will also pay national insurance on their salary. And in that context, that will increase. So the 35,000 that was the gross salary becomes 38,000 to the employer. But it then reduces by the income tax paid by the employee and the national insurance paid by the employee to give them a take-home pay of, let's say, about 18,000, 19,000 it is. But then when they spend that 19,000, they're paying VAT and all the other taxes. And the net result, if you do the sums, is that the cost that the employee gets roughly 50% of what it costs the employer. Now, can you think of anything more ridiculous than taxing people for working, taxing people for producing? And the whole National Health Service, the whole education service, our police, every public servant is costing us twice what they should do because of the stupid way in which we choose to tax. And so that's one thing that as an individual you could do, simply start asking questions. How come? And why is it that these issues are not presented at all? You can watch Question Time or any questions or whatever it is, and you'll only get a question now. I mean, even on this week, you possibly might have noticed, there was a question about income tax. And the question was, should there be more or less income tax? No suggestion that income tax in itself might not be a very intelligent way of collecting public revenue. And the one thing that we know that has inflated even during this last year is house prices. Well, houses haven't got more expensive, but the land upon which they stand has become even more desirable. So the whole housing, I mean, there's all sorts of ways in, depending on which one you want, but you could go for the housing. And again, just look at, and all the new planning regulations that are now being sought. So, our man says, doesn't he, we're going to build. That won't drop the price of housing at all. But it's a big bonanza for the property developers. we say we will give, we'll reduce we'll enable the deposit to come down to 5% or whatever. What do you think the effect of that's going to be? Increase house prices. So unless you get to the fundamentals, you're at a loss. But the role of the school as a school is we're not political at all. We're an educational charity. And as such, you need to be rather careful as to what you can do politically. But as individuals, in light of the knowledge, then you might do a lot. Of course, some individuals do a lot by realizing what a good deal this land investment business is. So you've got to be a bit careful on that front. I don't know if that comes anywhere near an answer to your question, Stephen, and it's not entirely satisfactory, but that's my offering at the moment.
No, that's very kind, and thank you for your time in responding. I think more low-hanging fruit, kind of day-to-day, would be appreciated. But no, I think Ellie Reeves, who is my MP in Bromley, who I've met a few times. Yeah, I will touch base with her and take her to task on that. The nurse, 1% is appalling, and I'll see what I can do, David.
Good luck with it. Brian, I'm seeing Brian Moran wanting to ask something.
Yes, please. I have a quick question. Suppose we were able to achieve taking the land away from the people who are sitting on it and collecting all our wealth, so we pay taxes so they get the benefits, and we have this running. How do you avoid an animal farm situation? I.e., who?
I'm sorry, Brian, I've not heard that very clearly. Can you?
Sorry, is that any better?
That's a bit better, yes.
Sorry. If we had the land taken from the people who currently have it and are not answerable to anybody apart from just taking the rent, and we have a way where the community owns the land, how do you organise things so that the people who run the land park don't turn into the pigs of Animal Farm?
We're not speaking here about land nationalisation. What would be proposed if you levy? Essentially what we're talking about is collecting the rent for the community.
Yep.
We're not confiscating the land at all. You simply collect the rent. So private enterprise is not inhibited one bit. You're not saying you can only do this. So it's not an Animal Farm scenario. Not that I'm awfully familiar with Animal Farm, but I'm taking it as an essentially communistic regime in which you're directed to do this or this or this. That's not the scenario that is envisaged here at all. What you do is collect rent based on the best permitted use. Now, of course, we have a planning system in which there is permission to use. But when planning permission is granted, that's an enormous bonanza to developers or the owners and the like. So no, we're not talking about land nationalisation. We're talking about collecting the rent and continuing to permit and protect exclusive tenancies. Exclusive tenancy is vital. And that's one of the difficulties, and in a sense it comes close to Robin's question, is why has this received such little purchase? Because we don't fall into, as it were, a left or a right camp. It's not communism, it's not capitalism, and it's not really a mixture of the two, because the fundamental difference is a recognition that capital is man-made, and it's perfectly appropriate to the individual. But the land is God-given, if you like, or natural, but its value derives from the presence of the community, i.e. no population, no land value. The more the population, the higher the land value. It arrives from the protections that the community give to that exclusive tenancy.
Sure.
It arises from the services that that community as a whole provide.
But if the same people own the land, are you saying the Duke of Westminster would continue to own all that very valuable land but the community would collect the rent instead of him?
Absolutely. He can call himself the landowner if he likes, but he has to pay the rent.
Right. Okay.
It's a label, isn't it? What do we mean by ownership? It's an idea. Again, it's an idea. Ownership is in fact an idea. It's in the subtle world. What you really want is the use of the land. I mean, how many of us have enjoyed a nice holiday in a rented cottage or even a rented car? I don't need to own it. I just want the use of it for a time, and I'm happy to pay for the use of it. But the idea is I own it. And that's
I think
unhealthy.
the Duke of Westminster might have some other views on that.
Oh, the Duke of Westminster would most definitely have some other views about it. And the Duke of Westminster is a very powerful individual, and he has very many powerful friends, which again comes somewhat close to Robin's question.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much for an excellent talk, by the way.
Thank you.
Any last question?
Isn't it, Peter?
About time, yeah. Okay, well, look, thank you very much, David. That was fantastic, really good. As always, you open up a view of economics which is so sort of rounded. We can all understand it. I think it was marvelous. Thank you very much. And in words that we could understand too. So I'm very, very grateful for that. I'm now going to stop the recording.